You're all set up to nymph that good-looking piece of water, but on your first cast, you realize your nymphs are flying down the river. The water's moving a little bit quicker than you thought. Well, that's no big deal, though. You just put on a little bit of split shot, add some distance between your indicator and your flies, and you'll be in business, right? Well, that all depends on how much weight you've added. Too much, and you'll be snagging the bottom on every drift, losing your flies and all your patience in the process. Today on Untangled, we'll walk through the foundational principles for effectively nymphing faster water and how to do it without losing a bunch of flies.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Excited to be back at the VFC Institute for Advanced Angling Studies, where we never give degrees because the learning never stops. And as part of that learning that we're always doing here each and every week, I got a little story to share about nymphing faster water, and then we'll get into all the foundational principles and the actual how-to of it. But the story really sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today. Back when I lived in Utah, there's this river that I used to fish all the time. And there's one particular spot on this little river that was a beautiful run between two larger pools. There's a big pool upstream and then a huge flat downstream of it. And this run connected the two. In a run, for those who don't know, it's just a section of river that's a little bit deeper, but the water's still moving fairly quickly. It's not as deep as a pool. Obviously, it's not as slow moving as a pool, but runs are deeper than riffles. Those are just the shallow parts of a river where you see the very dimpled, very almost uniform surface where you can see the river like going up and down over the little rocks and hitting all of those. That's what the riffles are. Runs are a really great place for fish to hang out because there's tons of food in a run. There's still a lot of aquatic insects for them to eat. There's other fish for them to eat when they get big enough to do that. But then the depth of a run and the little bit of surface disturbance that you get from a run also gives the fish some protection from overhead predators. So there's a lot to like about runs for fish. And this particular run that I fished all the time, it was stuffed with some really, really big rainbow trout. I'd seen huge ones come out of there. And over the years that I fished it, I probably lost a dozen or so that to me at the time were enormous. They were the fish I'd hang on the wall if I hung fish on walls. They were that size. They were the brag-worthy fish that you tell everybody and anybody about, even if they don't care about fishing. Okay, so I was really determined to try and figure out how to catch these because I'd hook them, but I was consistently losing them at the net. And then the issue too was I went a long time between hooking them. So I was losing them at the net, but then it never felt like I had any consistency in actually hooking them and actually getting into these bigger fish. So that was the frustrating part too, is when I would actually luck into one, then I would lose it right at the net. So there were a lot of issues that I ran into on this run. And the big problem that I really ran into, besides not knowing how to fight trout on a fly rod, fight big ones on a fly rod, was that the run was stuffed full of moss. So the fish, they would hang out on the bottom just barely above all the moss. It was almost no rocks and just a giant mat of moss on the bottom of this run. So what I had to do was I needed to get my nymphs deep enough that they were just bouncing right along the top of the moss, but not so deep that I was snagging on the moss on every single drift. Because if you've been there before, you know that, you're a bobber move, you set the hook and you get really excited thinking it's a fish and it's just more moss. And eventually it gets really old to just pick moss off your flies every single drift. And that's a lot of what I was doing in this run. And, more often than not, I couldn't figure out this delicate balance of getting my flies at the right depth, but not snagging moss. It just felt like a puzzle I could never quite crack. And I spent so much time re-rigging, tying on new flies, because I'd snag my flies, I'd lose them in the moss, or there was one rock in the run and I'd have my flies too deep and I'd hang up on the rock and I'd lose my whole rig. And, I probably went through an entire fly box worth of midges in this one run I don't know if it was that many, but it sure felt like it. It felt like a ton. Now, eventually, I managed to, I mentioned I did hook a few fish in there, and it was mostly luck that I hooked them because, like I said, I was trying to figure it out. I could not crack that code. I couldn't solve that puzzle. But eventually I did hook one, landed it, and it was all luck that I hooked and landed it. It was like a 20-inch rainbow. So it wasn't, I don't want to downplay a 20-inch trout because a 20-inch trout is a 20-inch trout. It's nothing to sneeze at, but it wasn't as big as some of the others that I'd seen in there. So I really, even though I'd caught and I'd landed one finally, and it was a bigger one, I still felt like there was unfinished business between me and this particular run, especially to where the only one that I'd hooked and landed out of it, even to me, felt like luck because I couldn't replicate it. It was the only one I caught out of there, and I couldn't go back and catch more because I would fall right back into that problem of hooking up on the moss or being too high in the water column and not hooking fish at all. So again, it felt like luck for all of those reasons. But I bring this up because a few years, I think it was a few years after I finally caught that fish out of that run. And once I'd caught the one, I still went back there because I still did want to figure it out, but I kind of moved on. But a few years after I finally pulled one out of there, I was up in this high mountain lake with my buddy Mysis Mike, and we were up pretty early in the season. So the lake was full. It's a reservoir, so the lake was full, and the fish were down deep. And Mike's the kind of angler, he can catch fish out of a storm drain. If fish lived in trees, he could catch them there too. I mean, the guy's just an animal. And he can put any rig together imaginable. If you can dream it up, there's a good chance that Mike's already fished it, and not only fished it, but used it to catch some trophy trout. And he'll casually mention it one day, like, oh yeah, over there's where I caught that 30-inch brown that one time. And you just look at him like, yeah, 30-inch browns are common, aren't they, Mike? So we're up on this lake. The fish were down deep. We didn't have any sinking lines. We didn't even have sink tip lines with us. So Mike just jimmy rigged, to me, what looked like a drop shot rig on his fly rod to help get his streamers down deep. And as soon as he did that, it's like a switch flipped. He starts pulling in big tiger trout, big splake, which is a hybrid between lake trout and brook trout, just pulling left and right, just pulling in these big fish. So I finally take a look at his rig, and I realize that not only is it the fly rod version of a drop shot rig, if you're familiar with that from fishing conventional tackle, but I realized in looking at it that, hey, this would be the absolute perfect rig for that spot on the river that I always fished that had given me so much grief. Never mind the fact that it worked super well on the lake and I caught a nice splake on that rig, but I was way more stoked about the fact that I'd finally seen a rig and finally learned about something that would actually work very well for that deep run on the river and any other deep run where I needed to get my flies down deep, but I didn't want them snagging. I wanted to be able to have a bit more firm control over their depth and their drift, and most importantly, how long they spent in that strike zone. Now, this rig goes by a lot of names, but in fly fishing, again, what we call a drop shot rig in conventional fishing is often called a bounce rig in fly fishing. And where I grew up, the Provo River bounce rig was very famous. It was used all the time and especially very popular on, obviously, the Provo River, where it got its name. Now, the idea behind the rig is pretty simple, and it's the same ethos behind the drop shot rig, where you put all of your weight on the bottom of your leader, and then you tie your flies above that weight, and you tie them in on small tags. Now, I know that a podcast is not a great place to describe rigs, so for the audio listeners, I'm sorry. For the video listeners, I do have a graphic on the screen that shows the rig, so I'll walk you through it, and the whole rig's up there. You can see that. And then for the audio listeners, I do have a link to this rig diagram in the show notes as well, so you can go grab that if my description of it doesn't paint that lovely picture in your head, as I am wont to do on occasion. But anyways, what I do to set up my version of the bounce rig, the way that I like to put it together, is I will take a 2 to 4 foot piece of tippet and I will use a blood knot to attach that to the end of my leader. You can use a triple surgeon's knot. That's what a lot of anglers use. The blood knot's actually easier for me to tie than a triple surgeon's. I learned it before I learned the surgeon's knot. So I just default to using it because I practiced it more. I'm quicker at it than I am at the surgeon's. It is a little bit slimmer. I like its profile. I feel like it might sink a tiny bit faster than a surgeon's. I have no idea. It's what I default to. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using a surgeon's knot here instead. But I will blood knot that tippet to the end of my leader, and then I'll leave one of those tag ends of the blood knot once I've pulled it and seated it tight. I'll leave one about 6 to 10 inches long, and then I will trim the other tag flush. Then I will do another blood knot with about 18 inches of tippet to the end of my leader now. And I'll leave another tag that's 6 to 10 inches long. And then at the end of my leader, it's now 3 to 5 feet longer than when I started, depending on how much I actually used. And I've got 2 knots, so 2 separate lengths of tippet tied onto there. At the very end of it, I'll just do a couple overhand knots, a couple inches, 2 or 3 inches above the end of the tippet. And those overhand knots is where I'm going to put my split shot. And I'm going to attach them above that knot so they don't slide down and slide off of the leader. And then the tag ends that are up above that, that's where I'm going to tie my nymphs onto. And the nymphs get to drift without any influence from the weight, but they're still sinking quickly. So this rig is effective. And this version of the bounce rig, which I don't know that it's super different than the technical official bounce rig. It's just the way that I set it up. But when I say that the flies get to drift without any influence from the weight, that can make it really effective in situations when the fish are taking flies a lot more softly or on rivers that get a ton of pressure. Because fish, if they go to eat your flies, you've got a tandem nymph rig and you've got a bunch of split shot on that tandem nymph rig. And that's when you tie one nymph and then you tie your next nymph off the bend of that nymph's hook. So you've got 2 or 3 nymphs all tied together. When the fish goes to eat one of those, usually it's got to move the weight of the fly, the tippet, and then any split shot that you've got on there. So it has to really eat it for you to register a strike up on your strike indicator. It's moving a lot more weight. And when they feel that resistance, sometimes they'll suck the fly in and spit it out because they feel the resistance. And you won't ever see your indicator move at all. The fish can spit a fly out that quickly. So when fish are used to being caught a lot, when they're used to things not feeling completely kosher in their environment, going to this bounce rig where you're fishing nymphs off of tags instead of in tandem, there's no weight that they have to pull on for you to register a strike. They just have to eat that fly. So it does give you a bit more sensitivity in that regard. And again, the rig's really effective. This bounce rig's really effective because it changes how the weight of the rig is distributed. So when you add, again, that split shot to the traditional nymph rig, to the tandem nymph rig, you're putting all of that weight ahead of the first fly. That's going to drag the entire rig down deep. It's going to be floating almost horizontally, and it's going to put all of your flies down near the bottom of the river. Now, that's really great for reaching the strike zone, and you're going to get down deep, and you're going to stay deep, but because every single one of your flies is that much deeper in the water column, it does increase your chances of hanging up on the bottom and losing flies. The traditional tandem rig also means, again, that when the fish go to eat your nymph, they're going to feel the weight of all the other flies in that rig, so it can be a little bit less sensitive and not spook the fish off, but definitely let them know that something ain't quite right here. Now, the bounce rig is very effective because with all that weight on the bottom, again, the flies are drifting freely, and you don't have to worry about them getting feedback from the rest of the rig and spitting the fly out as much. It can still happen, but in my experience, it's a bit more of a sensitive rig. But the best part about this is that because all your weight is what's on the bottom, that's dragging the rig down, but then your indicator is stopping it from going any deeper. So while that same thing happens with the traditional nymph rig, where yes, you put your indicator and it's going to keep things at a certain depth, when you put all the weight above your flies, that drags them all down to a lot closer at the same depth. Okay, you might have them floating a little bit higher depending on how much they're weighted, but it does get that rig drifting almost horizontally along the bottom. With the bounce rig and all the weight on the bottom of your rig, that is going to help the flies drift a lot more vertically. So the whole rig's going to be a lot more straight up and down in the water column. And at that point, you're only going to have the one fly that's down low that's close to those snags. And if you rig it up correctly, usually what's going to snag and hang up is going to be your split shot. So it might snag, it might bounce, you set the hook, and if you snag and break off, it's usually the split shot that does it and not your flies. Split shot's a lot cheaper to replace and a lot quicker to retie under the whole rig than a fly. So it does have some advantages there in terms of helping you not lose as many flies. So let's zoom out for a minute. It was really into the weeds, really in depth there, and I hope I didn't lose you too much. But if we zoom out, we look at the principles of fly fishing with nymphs. We know that we need to get our flies in front of fish, which usually means they need to be in that bottom third of the water column. We also know that we want those flies to stay in that strike zone as long as possible, and we want them to look as real as possible. So if we can pull that off, then we have dramatically increased our chances for catching fish. We've done what we needed to do out there. This holds true whether you're fishing a riffle, a run, or a pool. But runs present a bit of a unique challenge because they're both fast and they're deep. So you've got to get your flies down deep. You've got to get them to sink, but you've got to get them to do that without hanging up and snagging on everything in sight. And that's why the bounce rig is so effective for this type of water, because it meets those foundational principles. It gets your flies deep, it keeps them where they need to be, and it makes them look real. But it comes with the added benefit of, with the flies drifting much more vertically instead of horizontally, your likelihood of snagging up and losing them is a lot lower. And this does tend to be the most effective way to fish runs, especially on bigger rivers with really wide, deep runs. The bounce rig can just be really, really, really effective. So I think the next natural question here that we've got to answer is, well, if the bounce rig is so great, then why don't we use it all the time? And Durant, didn't you just say on a podcast a few weeks ago that you prefer to fish your nymphs in tandem and don't like fishing them off tags? Yes, I do. In a lot of ways, because I think tandem nymph rigs are easier to cast, they tangle up less, and you can be more accurate when you're placing them in specific spots in the river than you can with the bounce rig. However, just because it's what I prefer to do and what I've always done does not necessarily mean it is the right way to fish. I say that all the time. Just because it's what I do doesn't mean it's what you should do. And objectively speaking, the bounce rig, tying your nymphs off of tags, is going to, on bigger rivers, it's probably going to be a little bit more effective, especially on faster runs. It's going to be a little bit more effective because you've got to get those flies right where they need to be and get them to stay there without snagging up, especially in the water that's moving a little bit quicker on the surface. So if the bounce rig is so great, then why don't we use it all the time? Well, the answer is pretty simple, to be completely honest with you. In our experience here at VFC, it's not a one-size-fits-all rig. It's great for faster runs where you don't want to hang up and lose your flies on the bottom. Alex uses a version of the bounce rig a lot. It's his go-to setup for nymph fishing a lot of the times, unless we're on smaller water. When the runs and the holes are long, they're wide, the fish are fairly evenly distributed throughout that run, it's a great option, especially if, again, the water's moving a little bit quicker. It's going to get your flies down, it's going to keep them there, and they're going to stay in that strike zone a little bit longer than they will with a tandem nymph rig. But it's not that easy to cast. Okay, you're going to get quite a few tangles when you start out with this because you've got to slow down your cast. You got to open the loop up a little bit to be effective with it. And it's heavy. It is a lot heavier than the tandem nymph rig. So on smaller water, all of that weight and the way that weight's distributed hitting the water can spook fish. And then in tighter pockets, where accuracy matters and you've really got to get your nymphs in a smaller window, the traditional tandem nymph rig is going to be a lot more accurate. It's going to be a bit easier to use in those instances. So with all that in mind, I'd honestly say that the bounce rig really is tailored for use in runs. It's a bit too heavy to use in riffles. When I've tried it in riffles, the split shot just ends up hanging up in the rocks a ton. So I lose that part of the rig a lot. I just don't like fishing it in riffles. And I think it's a little bit too heavy to fish in pools as well, because again, all of that weight hitting the surface can spook the fish. It's a rig that just like the title of the show says, just like we talked about at the beginning, it really is tailored for faster, deeper water that's moving at a decent speed. That's where this rig really shines. And regardless of how you set it up, regardless of what tweaks you make to make it work for you, the principles are the key to remember. When you remember the principles, instead of exact rigs, you really start to understand how and why we do things the way that we do and why that matters. It's what we talk about all the time here at VFC. Understanding the why is key to becoming a great angler. Okay. So the principles are: get your flies in front of fish, make them look real, keep them in that strike zone as long as possible. Don't hang up and lose your flies on every rock or piece of moss in the river. The bounce rig ticks all those boxes for that faster, deeper water in those runs. And if you'd like some more information about all the other rigs that we recommend for fishing different types of water, we do have our pocket nymphing guide that walks you through all the basics of nymphing. It's got diagrams of the bounce rig, all the other rigs for nymphing that we recommend. I'll throw a link to it in the show notes or right here on the screen. If you're watching the video podcast, you can grab that. It really is like A to Z about nymphing in a short little guide. So definitely pick that up if you want some more rig diagrams or just want reminders of what we talked about today. And if you've got any more questions about the bounce rig or just nymphing in general, please drop those in the comments. Let me know. But speaking of questions, it's time to wrap up the beginning of the show this week and move right into the Q&A portion of this week's show. Because every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question you would like answered, there's a link to send those into us down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Our first question today is from Andrew from Oregon, who writes in and says, when it comes to the best flies to use throughout the day, what ones are best for morning, midday, and evening during the spring and summer? I didn't know if you guys had already answered this or not, but it was just something that came into mind when I go out early in the morning and fish all day. Thank you guys for teaching us everything we need to know about fly fishing. Andrew, good question, and I don't think it's everything you need to know about fly fishing here. I would hope so, but I'm definitely missing out on some of the other stuff. So don't just depend solely on us for things, but I appreciate the kind words anyways, man. Thank you. So, big picture. Let's look at the big picture part of your question for a minute. There is no such thing as a certain type of fly that you should only fish at a certain time of the day. That doesn't exist. Your job as a fly angler isn't to pick from a list of prescribed flies for a problem. It's not like you're, oh, well, this is happening, do X, right? Your job is to pick the fly that best represents what's going on in the moment. Okay. One day that might mean you're tying on parachute blue-winged olives. The next day might mean you're fishing nymphs. It's going to change consistently. So you have to have that mindset of, I generally know what to expect, but I'm flexible enough to react to what's happening on the ground right now. That needs to be your job as a fly angler. Okay, so to drill down and answer the question on a more macro scale, some hatches do occur earlier in the morning, and some are generally more evening hatches, and others can come off at just about any time of the day. A morning hatch would be the pale morning dun, because as its name suggests, this is a mayfly that tends to hatch earlier in the day. They'll come off at other times of the day too. I've fished PMDs late in the evening. But when I've been in the best PMD hatches, when I've had the best PMD fishing, it's generally been from about dawn until about lunchtime is when I've seen the PMD hatches that I would write stories about, because they were just, it was like fishing in a snowstorm almost. There were so many of them, and it looked like snow falling because they're that really light cream color. But, and just to drive this point home, Alex did catch a big rainbow trout last July on a PMD at like 2 p.m. too. So it's not exclusively a morning hatch, just tends to be a lot of them in the mornings. Some of the best caddis hatches that I've ever fished have been evening hatches, including one in Montana where it felt like I caught a fish on every cast until it was too dark to see anymore. And the caddis were just thick. Almost couldn't breathe without sucking them in. Kind of thick. It was amazing. You do see caddis moving later in the evening. You do see those big migrations from the bushes to the river, or from the river to the bushes, where they like to hang out before they go back and lay their eggs. So it's really not uncommon to see fish, keyed on caddis a little bit during the evening when those bugs are moving. But I've also caught fish on caddis at like 3 p.m. too. So, there's very rarely going to be the time when I'm going to fish this right now. I'm going to fish this right now. Okay. And then, just down that same rabbit hole, when you get to the river and nothing's hatching, there's fish aren't rising. There aren't bugs in the air. That's when you turn to your nymphs and your streamers. That's when you turn to representing, the other food items that fish are eating besides the adult versions of those bugs. That's when, again, your nymphs and streamers are really going to come into play, is when nothing's actively hatching. And most of the day, things aren't actively hatching. The hatches are generally a little bit shorter. They're going to be shorter stretches of time than when nothing's hatching. Okay. So what it really comes down to is having a good idea of what's likely to hatch that day, and then being prepared to match all stages of those hatches. And we actually put together a year-round hatch chart that tells you when and where bugs are most likely to hatch. And it's a great resource to have on hand to answer questions like this. If you're not sure of what you might run into on the water on a given day, it's going to give you that general timeline of when bugs hatch, so you can be prepared to match all of those hatches. And I'll throw a link to that down in the show notes or right here on the screen. If you're watching the video podcast, you can grab that year-round hatch chart. Again, it's free. You can go grab that and just keep it on your phone to consult during the next hatch. But let's go ahead and let's game plan this a little bit. Let's look ahead to the next hatch and go through that. So our next big hatch is probably going to be blue-winged olives. Most of us are probably going to experience that sometime in about April. Midges are likely going to start hatching in bigger numbers then as well. But so with midges and blue-winged olives coming off, that's going to be our next big hatch. If I was going to go to the river and it's April and that's what I was expecting to see, then, I would have a good selection of midge and mayfly nymphs in my box in various sizes, probably from like size 16 to size 20. I'd also have a good selection of midge and mayfly emergers from sizes 16 to 20. Then I'd have a good selection of midge and mayfly adults in sizes 14 to 20. And then finally, I would have a few spinners or spent wings in case there's a spinner fall later in the day, usually in sizes 16 and 18, maybe down to 20 as well. So that's what I would have in the box, prepped and ready to go for a day in April when it's very likely you're going to see blue wings and midges both hatching. But then when I get to the water, right, I'm not going to just say, it's the beginning of the day, something hasn't hatched yet, so I'm going to tie this on. Nope. I'm going to be looking for clues that tell me about what the fish are eating. Are the fish rising? If they are rising, are they coming all the way out of the water to eat? Am I seeing their noses break the surface? Am I seeing their heads? Or am I just seeing smaller, subtle rises where it's really just their dorsal fin and their tail fin that I see breaking the surface? If it's the former, that means I need to tie on adults because the fish are eating the duns. If it's the latter, it's just their dorsal and their tail fins breaking the surface, that means I need to tie on emergers because they're eating stuff right underneath the surface or right in the surface film, and the emergers are going to match that food source closely. Okay, so that's what I'm really going to be looking for. Now, if the fish aren't rising, then a nymph and emerger rig is going to be a great go-to, and I'd probably fish a nymph down low and then an emerger up high. I'd fish those underneath an indicator or something, and I'd fish that until the hatch starts, until I start to see bugs coming off. And when I start to see bugs coming off, even if the fish aren't rising yet, then I might move that rig of mine. I might put 2 emergers on and fish it in the top half of the water column instead of the bottom third. Move them up because those bugs are starting to rise up through the water column. They're going to start hatching on the surface. So I need to be fishing not as deep because I need my flies to be where the bugs are. I need to be where the fish are. Okay? And that's going to not be on the bottom when this hatch is starting. Okay. And then when the hatch starts, that's when I'm going to switch to my dry flies. The key here is I'm going to go to the river. I'm going to anticipate what I think is likely going to happen. And then I've got flies that cover all of those possibilities. Because even though the blue wings are hatching, sometimes the fish might still just want to eat midges and vice versa. So you do need to pay very close attention to what they're actually eating because, yes, you might expect blue wings to be the big menu item, but the fish will surprise you sometimes and they'll just say, nah, I'm just going to go ahead and eat this bunch of midges instead of that blue wing. So you do have to be prepared. You do have to be reacting to what's going on out there on the water. If you are prepared for what might happen, you're willing to adapt, and you're paying attention to what the river's telling you, and you're picking your flies based on that, then knowing what to fish at certain times of the day is not going to be this big mystery. Okay, it's just going to be, I'm following the fish. I'm as close as I can. I'm staying along to what the fish are expecting, what I'm expecting out of the fish. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And again, that hatch chart is going to be a good resource for you to use. Definitely go grab that if you don't have it already. But very great question. Thanks for sending it in. Appreciate it. Carrie from Germany has our next question, writes in and says, hello, I am relatively new to fly fishing. It's winter and there's a pond not too far away that is reserved exclusively for fly fishing. The water is pretty clear and I have seen some good-looking fish swing around the transition zones. They come out into the clearer water for just a short moment and then head back into the deeper, more obscure water where they spend most of their time. I really want to get a streamer down there, but it's deep. It's really hard to cast a streamer on a 9-foot leader and floating line. However, if I use a shorter leader to make casting easier, it won't get down deep enough. I've been listening to the podcast and have learned that some people buy a 6-weight rod with a sinking line and fluoro tippet to use in this situation. I'm not sure I want to buy a whole new rod, but I do have an extra spool for my standard 9-foot 5-weight. I'm thinking about buying a 5-weight sinking line to put on my extra spool to use for streamers. Do you think such a setup would cast well enough and work? If so, what type of sinking line should I buy? Carrie, this is a great question, and I love how you're approaching the problem and you're trying to figure out a solution based on the stuff that you've got already and not just buying, not just buying a new rod and reel because that's going to solve the problem. I have fallen into that trap so many times. And I would have saved myself a lot of money if I'd learned this lesson earlier on. So congrats to you. Initial thoughts. Unless this lake is really deep, I would not buy a full sinking line to use in this instance. I would use a sink tip line instead, or they do make these lines that are sink tip followed by intermediate line. So what that means is the first 15 feet of the line is designed to sink, and it'll sink at whatever rate it is, 3 inches per second, 5 inches per second, 7 inches per second, whatever the box says. But then that intermediate line, it's not floating line, but it's not sinking line. It's line that will just, kind of sit in that intermediate zone. It's not going to go all the way to the bottom. It's not going to go all the way to the surface, but that's going to help keep your flies down deep and help keep them at a very nice horizontal presentation like you would expect streamers to be. And then the back half of that line, so that might be that intermediate and sink tip part of the line might be 50 feet. And then you might have 40 feet of floating line behind that. Or you might have even more intermediate line behind that. But I wouldn't get a full sink line unless it's really deep because those can be just a little bit trickier to fish and they're not as versatile for when you need to be in shallow water and then move to deep water. Or if you want to use this setup on a river, full sink lines on a river are really kind of tough because they'll often sink too deep too quickly. And then you're losing a lot of streamers on everything and whatnot. So a sink tip line, even a sink tip followed by some intermediate line, like I described, is going to be a little bit better on the rivers. It's just going to be a bit more versatile line. So that's why I always default to using some sort of sink tip, because you do get more versatility out of it versus the full sink is really designed for deep lake fishing, and you don't have as much versatility with that type of line. So, directly answering your question, a 5-weight fly rod with a sink tip line and a shorter leader, absolutely. That would be a great way to fish a lake. There's no reason to not use that. A lot of us like the 6-weight because a 6-weight rod will throw a 6-weight line, and 6-weight lines throw heavier flies. And if you remember, fly rods are rated for the size of line they cast, and the size of line you cast directly correlates to the size of fly you cast. So you can throw bigger flies a bit easier, have more control with them on your 6-weight than you can with your 5-weight. So if you do need to throw a really big streamer and that's going to be what catches those fish, it might be worth bumping up to a 6-weight. But you know, you can still get away with that on a 5-weight. If you load it up with a really big streamer and that sink tip line, you might feel more like a slingshot than a fly rod. Sometimes if you do that, it's going to be a bit more work. It's not going to be as efficient as a 6-weight. You could still get away with it. But if you keep your streamers like size 8, size 10, maybe even down to a 6, depending on how heavy it is, you should be fine with that on a 5-weight. But even with that sink tip line, you should be okay with it. Again, it's not going to be as easy or as efficient as if it was a 6-weight, but you will be just fine throwing that on a 5-weight. As far as the sink tip lines themselves, I really enjoy my sink tip lines from Scientific Anglers. And then Airflow makes some fantastic sink tip lines as well. Just make sure you're buying them in a 5-weight, and I would definitely look at buying one that's a sink tip followed by some intermediate line. We used those a couple weeks ago. Alex and I did when we were chucking streamers on a big river, and I was amazed at how much better of a presentation I got with that versus sink tip that goes right into floating line, because the sink tip that goes into intermediate line just kept those flies cruising at that nice horizontal, just right above the bottom, kept them just cruising perfectly for a lot longer versus the sink tip that goes right into a floating line was pulling them up through the water column just a little bit too much. So that's what I would personally go with, but see what you can find. And Airflow does sell, I think they're based in England somewhere, so they do have a big European presence, so it should be easier to pick up in Germany maybe than Scientific Anglers would be. But that's what I would go with, and I appreciate the question a bunch. Thanks. Trevin from Idaho has our next question, writes in and says, how far off the bottom should my nymph be for it to be in the strike zone? The podcasts are awesome and give very good info for a beginner like me. Helped me drastically and have caught more fish. Trevin, thanks, man. I'm glad to hear that the podcast has helped you out. Appreciate that a bunch. And this is a good question. We touched on this a little bit earlier in the show today, but this is one of my favorite answers to give. So I really had to read your question because the answer to your question is, it depends. Usually, you want your nymphs down as close to the bottom as possible. Fish are likely when they're not eating off the top or there's not a hatch that's just about to start. Fish are more than likely sitting down at the bottom of the river, holding in the water that's moving as slow as possible. Okay, because the water moves slower at the bottom of the river than it does up near the surface. The fish want to spend as little energy as possible and get the most amount of food. So that usually means they're going to be hanging out closer to the bottom because they can still eat a lot of food, but they're not spending a ton of energy swimming in fast current. Now, if there's a hatch and the flies are starting to emerge or starting to move up in that water column, those fish might not be holding right on the bottom. They might be a foot or two off the bottom, or they might be 2 or 3 feet off the bottom, depending on how deep the river is. If you're in a small piece of water, though, the fish might be holding on the bottom of the run, but the surface is only like 18 inches or 2 feet away from them. So when a dry fly drifts over them, they might be willing to rise that distance because it's relatively short and eat that dry fly versus if you're at a run where, say it's 5 feet deep and the fish are holding on the bottom, they might not go all the way for that dry fly. It just might not be worth the energy to them. So it really is going to depend on what the bugs are doing and how the fish are reacting to them. Okay, that you will have to adjust your setup, not just day by day, but honestly hole by hole, because one run's going to be deeper or shallower than the next. So you're going to need to continually adjust that. What I try to do is, again, generally speaking, try to get my nymphs as close to the bottom as I can. I like to say that you should focus on getting them in that bottom third of the water column. If you're fishing a 2-nymph rig, which I think a lot of us do, you want your bottom one just ticking above the surface. And then I usually do at least 18 inches to my next fly. So that means I would have one fish right on the bottom and one fly right on the bottom, and then one fly right about 18 inches above that. And that's going to cover the bottom third of that water column very effectively with those two flies. Now, how to know you're down in that depth? That's another question we get all the time. Well, the best way to figure that out is you know you're on the bottom if you're hanging up and you're snagging every single cast. Your bottom fly is definitely on the bottom. At that point, you need to move your indicator towards your flies a little bit. Start with like 4 or 5 inches. Move it just a bit. Then you throw your cast back out there, and if you snag only every 4 or 5 drifts at that point, then you're probably right exactly where you need to be. Okay, if you throw your nymphs out there and you're not snagging at all, then you're probably not deep enough. You got to toy around with that depth until you can feel or see your flies ticking right along the bottom, snagging maybe every 5 or 6 drifts or so, but not every single drift. That means you're just a titch too deep. And then, of course, if you throw your flies out there and you're consistently catching fish, you're at the right depth. You don't need to worry about it. You don't need to adjust it. So hopefully that is helpful, Trevin. I really appreciate the question. And appreciate all the questions we get here at VFC. Definitely keep sending your questions on in, because the more questions we get, the more we can help y'all live real life. That's our whole goal here at VFC. And even if your question doesn't get read during the show, every question, I read every single question that y'all send in, and just knowing what questions you guys have, they help craft, the open of the show, the beginning portion of the show. They really influence everything we do here at VFC. So your questions are really important to us. But it is time now, folks, to wrap the show up with the Live Real Life moment. And every week here at Untangled, we end the show by sharing a story and a picture from someone out in the VFC audience who is living real life. We love to see and get a peek into the adventures that y'all are up to. It's tons of fun to see the great times y'all are having. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to share, there's a link to send those in down in the show notes, or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from BJ, who writes in and says, "Hello, Spencer from Colorado. I thought of going up to Wyoming, but was disappointed when you said all the fish have drowned there. Your podcasts have helped me improve at fly fishing. I was on a lake this morning, and your advice about casting, about picking up the rod slowly, then pulling up faster like an airplane taking off, helped to eliminate the sloop sound I always used to get. So today I was casting with a leech pattern and caught a gorgeous 10-inch rainbow that had lots of pink and spots. It looked like a stalked fish that had gone wild. Sorry, no photo. I was afraid to drop my phone in the water. Then I noticed some rings with an occasional trout nose coming out of the water, and so I put on a dry fly. Soon I Indiana Jonesed it with a snap, losing my fly. Then I recalled some advice I got either from you or Brian Fleshig about waiting longer on the back cast. Then I noticed that most of the rings were subsurface, and so I tried what looked like an emerging mayfly. On my second cast, I caught a trout that leaped clear out of the water. It was only 8 inches at most, but on a fly rod, it felt like a lunker. Later, when I went home, I listened to your most recent podcast about mayflies. You mentioned the jujubatus, and I did not know what this looked like. I had to ask Siri how to spell it. I looked it up and saw that the subsurface olive-colored fly that I had caught the 8-incher on was a jujubatus. I like the learning challenge of fly fishing and the process of more learning of trying different flies that might work. There is so much to learn, and your podcast makes learning fun and relaxed. With your help, I think I've gone from beginner to an advanced beginner. Tight lines." BJ, I love it. Thanks for sending that story in. It's so great when you're out on the water and you can problem solve in real time and then it works. That's probably the most addicting part of fly fishing for a lot of us, especially for me. yes, the fish are cool and catching them's cool and figuring out the puzzle is cool. But when you're doing something and then you see the fish acting a certain way and you can go, oh, I know what to do. I can figure this out. And you execute it and it works. That is just such a sweet feeling. And it is enough to keep you coming back all the time. So thanks for sending that in. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who listens and watches to the show every single week. That helps us out more than you know. And if you want to help us out even more, tell everybody you know about VFC. Really, to spread the word. Start sending your own smoke signals. Start your own carrier pigeon network, maybe even your own Pony Express line, and just spread the word. Let them know what we've got here, how we can help everybody live real life. That's our goal. That's what we want to do. We want to see people out there enjoying it, having fun, catching fish, and having those live real life moments that make this so worth it. So with that, folks, thanks again for listening. Appreciate it a bunch. Stay safe. Go out, catch some fish this week. And until next time, live real life.